Welcome one and all to the online learning platform of Department of Civil Engineering, BMS Institute of Technology and Management, Bangalore. I am Dr. Rajesh Gopinath, and today you are along with me for the course Environmental Protection and Management. As you can see in slide 5, in the last session we had a discussion about continual improvement and pollution prevention. In today's session, as you can see in slide 6, we shall be discussing about initial environmental review. I shall be taking you through the salient features. We shall also have a discussion with a worksheet, and finally I shall be summarizing the session and listing the references for your kind perusal. Let us now move on to slide 7 to begin the session. As you can see in the image which has been depicted for you in slide 7, we are aware that implementation of any environmental management system in any organization has to be comprehensive, understandable and transparent. Okay, so once we contact any competent body who can assist us in this aspect, then the very first step that needs to be carried out is the initial environmental review. So basically, what is initial environmental review? In simple words, it is an assessment of impacts and environmental aspects which is associated with the particular organization's activity. So what does environmental review basically provide you with? It provides you a snapshot of a company's performance for a particular point in time. It will highlight the company's environmental impacts, thereby allowing action to be taken where it is actually most required. Okay, please remember, the purpose is to find and evaluate as many areas as possible in which the enterprise can improve its environmental performance, which means least or negligible or minimal damage to the environment due to the activities which happen within the organization or due to the organization. So how do we go about doing the assessment? There are various criteria that we need to consider. Okay, for instance, the regulatory obligations, the legislations, the risks to the environment, the occurrence of incidents, okay, the actual and potential nuisances, the international resource usage or resource management issues, and yes, definitely lack of information or data to make a satisfactory appraisal. Let us now move on to slide 8 to understand more salient features of initial environmental review. So as previously discussed, now we are all aware the first step in creating an EMS is to perform the initial environment review. Okay, therefore this basically tells you where you are and hence creates a roadmap for your organization. As previously also divulged, an initial environmental review is an analysis of the environmental problems that has been caused by the activities of the organization. Hence, we may say that the initial environmental review identifies, observes, highlights, showcases or spots the most significant direct and indirect environmental aspects as well as any impact of the organization. Please note, the initial environmental review also establishes benchmarks, and this is in order to quantify or measure the future successes in impact reduction. Basically, there are 5 main parts to the environmental review. As you can see, I have listed those 5 main parts or 5 main steps: the organizational context, the interested parties to EMS, the legal environmental requirements, the direct aspects and the indirect environmental aspects. Now, let us start with the first step, that is determining the organizational context, that is the internal and external issues that might positively or negatively affect the environmental management. Now, this includes the influence of environmental issues such as climate, air quality, water quality, natural resource availability and biodiversity on your futuristic EMS. One should also look at the external and internal factors such as cultural, social or political circumstances, or even the organization's activity, its organizational culture and its capability. Moving on, the second step or the second part, to determine the interested parties to the EMS, that is employees, shareholders, suppliers and so forth. So here it's about understanding and determining the needs and expectations of these stakeholders. Basically, any organization can decide to voluntarily fulfill these needs or expectations. In that case, it will definitely become part of the company's compliance obligations in the EMS. Let's move on to the third step. Herein, the company must consider all the regulations that can have an operational impact. That is, after the company has found out who the interested parties are, the company or organization must identify its legal environmental requirements and check its compliance. The compliance check can be done either independently or with the help of a consultant. The next part or step is with respect to the identification of the direct aspects. Now herein, the company has to outline the current operations and its management. The organization or the enterprise has to basically examine in detail its activities in terms of consumption of raw materials and energy, and as well the production of wastes and emissions. Therefore, we are talking about the direct aspects. As a last step or the final part, the company or the organization also must look into its indirect environmental aspects, that is, the activities which impact the environment for which the organization is responsible indirectly or inadvertently. Okay, the ideology or objective is one should understand how to deal with these indirect environmental aspects. My dear friends, the most important part of the initial environmental review is basically examining these two last steps or elements or parts, that is the direct and indirect environmental aspects in a life cycle perspective. That means that the organization should consider all stages of a product or service, say from raw material acquisition, its purchase, procurement, design, production, transportation, utilization, end of life treatment, and finally disposal. That is, all these life cycle stages have to be considered in the environmental impacts. So basically, how is initial environmental review benefiting an organization? Primarily, it helps to determine the organization's environmental position. And secondly, it helps to detect opportunities for improvement in-house as well as externally. That is probably with respect to the vendors or contractors, etc. Now, in this slide, we have now understood the 5 steps of initial environmental review, and we have understood the advantages it offers to the organization. Now let us move on to slide 9 to understand a typical worksheet. As you can see in slide 9, this checklist basically contains information about revision history. Obviously, as you are talking about continual improvement, an industry or organization would have carried out several iterations of an initial environmental review, and based on every iteration there would have been revisions carried out with respect to its operations or shops or departments or sections, and this information has to be first produced. As you can see, the details required are the date of revision, description of the revision, which sections have been affected by this revision, who was in charge or who was the expert who had advised with respect to the revision, and finally the approval authority. This prior information is required because it in itself will give us a glimpse of the internal operations and activities within the organization. As you can see in the same slide 9, initial environmental review worksheet continues with the pro forma, wherein we need to enter details such as name of the company, the department which is being dealt with, the location of the company, the details of the reviewer or the expert involved in this initial environmental review, and the date on which the review is being conducted. Now let us move on to slide 10. In slide 10, the first part is the general information, wherein you need to list out all the personals who have been interviewed with respect to initial environmental review. Then the organizational structure has to be acquired and represented. That is, what is the hierarchy of this organization? What are the various levels? The vertical levels, the horizontal levels. How is the chain of communication? How is the flow of instructions? Who are the people who are responsible and authoritative in each level, each department? All this information has to be listed in this first part of the worksheet, which comes under the category of general information. Now, if you look further, there is a checklist, kind of a questionnaire which has been provided. Now, let us look at the salient features of some of these questions that are raised in part 1, general information. As you can see in this slide 11, the basic information that is being procured are such as what are the various activities which is being carried out alongside the process flow, or what are the products that are being dealt with. They need to be listed. How many employees are working in the organization? Who is the environmental coordinator and what are his or her details? What are the various facilities which is there within the organization? For instance, office space, laboratory space, workshop, warehouse, and so forth. What are the various plants or machineries which are being utilized within this organization? Who are the major suppliers for the raw materials and goods, and what are the various product types? Who are the major contractors and their product types? Also, are there any future activities or services that is being envisioned? So basically, all this data has to be acquired, procured, and for each of these activities, each of these information which has been collected, you need to analyze whether it is good to go or whether there is certain things among these which requires attention. Subsequently, this checklist is providing vital inputs and information with respect to the gray areas that needs to be worked on, the green areas which are working perfectly. With this information, now let us move on to the next part of the worksheet, that is part 2. Let us move on to slide 11. Part 2 deals with materials and energy usage and their control. Again, in this part, the information has to be collected by interviewing the working personnels, and details of all those personnels who have been interviewed has to be mentioned. Again, with respect to the questionnaire and the feedback which has been received, the final objective is how many of these lie in the gray area and how many of these lie in the green area. That is, how many of these are good to go and there is no need of any further intervention, and how many of these are gray areas which require intervention and improvisation. This part of the worksheet basically is aided by inventories, purchasing records, consumption records, bills which have been paid. Okay, so what is the data that we are looking at here? We are looking at information such as what materials are being purchased, how they are being consumed, what is a quantitative assessment for the material which has come to the organization. Okay, now what are the practices within the organization with respect to usage control or housekeeping or recycling? Or let us take an instance of water. How much water is being consumed? Who are the major water usage groups within the plant, within the facility? Are there any water treatment facilities? Are there any water conservation measures, say rainwater harvesting, groundwater recharging? Or let us say how much electricity is being consumed, who is supplying the electricity, what is the consumption pattern, who are the major electricity consumption usage groups, what are the conservation measures, say renewable energy, solar energy, wind energy. So basically part 2 of this worksheet deals with the inventorization, the consumption, the conservation aspects with respect to materials, which includes raw materials, water, energy. With this information, now let us move on to the next slide. Slide 12. Part 3 of this worksheet basically deals with the storage and handling aspects of the materials. As usual, the personals who have been interviewed have to be mentioned here with the details. Once again, based on the comments and feedback, the green areas and gray areas have to be highlighted. Green areas are those which does not require any attention, while gray areas are those which require attention and intervention for continual improvement. So basically, what does part 3 deal with? It speaks about details with respect to the types and quantity of materials which have been stored. That is, the list of chemicals which are being engaged in the organization. What are those specifications? Is there an inventory control procedure with respect to these materials? Is there a record with respect to expired products or expired chemicals? Are there details available with respect to spillages, leakages? Are there information available about measures to handle spills? So these details are reviewed and worked upon. This basically is an overview of the good housekeeping practices, good utilization practices, good storage and handling practices. Now let us move on to the next slide. Slide 13. This basically deals with wastewater management, that is part 4. As usual, once again, the common areas, who are the personnel who have been interviewed and their details. The green areas which are good to go and does not require any attention. The gray areas based on the comments which require intervention and attention. So basically, what is that we are dealing with respect to wastewater here? What are the sources of wastewater? What are the characteristics? And this is obviously based on the reports, that is the physical characteristics, maybe the color, the temperature, the odor, or the chemical characteristics with respect to its organic demand, or with respect to its chemical presence or heavy metal presence or toxicity, or with respect to biological characteristics based on any pathogenic presence in the wastewater. What is the treatment that is being carried out in the organization for the wastewater? Is it in situ or off-site? That is there a treatment within the organizational premise? In that case, the flow diagram or the flow chart of the treatment process highlighting the preliminary treatment, primary treatment, secondary treatment, tertiary treatment has to be provided. There should be manuals for all of these machineries. So what are the practices in place for recycling wastewater or minimizing the wastewater or reusing the wastewater? Where is the wastewater being discharged to, and in what quantity and in what quality? What are the relevant licenses for discharging, and what are the regulatory requirements and legislations to which a compliance has to be met? And finally, most importantly, there should be quantitative record of how much of wastewater is being discharged. Basically, the amount of water which enters the premise, the amount of wastewater being generated, and the amount of wastewater being discharged gives us an idea of how well water and wastewater is being managed. Now let us move on to slide 14, that is part 5, air emission management. Here also you need to provide information with respect to the personnel who have been interviewed, and the details have to be provided. You need to identify based on the comments the green areas and gray areas, that is the one which has good to go status and the other which requires attention or intervention. So basically when you're talking about air emissions, we are trying to relate with respect to any possible contribution to environmental pollution with respect to the ambient air. That is, are there any emission sources? They have to be listed. Now, when there are any emissions taking place from the industry, then the characteristics of the plume, the characteristics of the smoke or the emissions have to be documented. An analysis has to be carried out and the report has to be provided. The same report has to be incepted into this worksheet. Okay, for instance, how much of carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or oxides of nitrogen or carbon monoxide is being released into the ambient atmosphere. Now, what are the air pollution control methods in place? The flow diagram, the treatment process, the system operating manuals, the standard operating procedures, they also have to be provided in this part of the worksheet. What are the air emission minimization measures in practice? What are the housekeeping measures? Are there any interventions already existing with respect to product modification, process modification, raw material modification? They have to be mentioned here. Now, the air which is being emitted as an outcome of the industrial activity, the database with respect to its emission must be recorded. Time, date, quantity, all these recordings must be in place. What are the environmental legislations which impact or are connected to this part of the worksheet? For instance, Air Quality Act 1981. What are the necessary licenses that the company has secured for releasing the polluted air? All these must be documented and must be in place. Let us now move on to the next slide, slide 15, which deals with part 6, chemical waste management. Here, once again, you need to make a list of all the personnel whom you have interviewed and have their information made available. Also, based on the comments and feedback, you need to identify good to go and needs attention areas, that is green areas and gray areas, wherein there is requirement of intervention and there is no requirement. Okay. Now, what are the information that you need to collect with respect to chemical waste management? You need to identify first and foremost what are the various waste sources, that is from where all within the industry chemical waste is being generated. Secondly, you must list all the types of chemical waste which is being produced. You must have characteristics of these chemical waste, that is an analysis must have been carried out with respect to its toxicity or carcinogenicity or acidity or alkalinity or corrosivity. Further, you must also have a treatment process flow diagram, the standard operating procedures, the system operating manuals, the list of waste collectors. I am talking with respect to clause C, that is chemical waste handling and treatment methods. Also in this checklist or worksheet, you must collect the various measures which are being practiced to reuse, recycle or minimize the chemical waste. Okay. Finally, how do you dispose the chemical waste? Whom do you dispose it to? All that information has to be collected. All the records with respect to chemical waste disposal has to be maintained intact. What date, what time, what quantity and whom to. This is very important in the context of chemical waste management. And yes, what are the licenses that the company has secured or procured to carry out disposal of chemical waste or handle chemical waste? That also needs to be submitted or provided in this worksheet in this part 6. Also, what all legislations or acts that are related to the chemical waste management also should be mentioned here. The idea is any act which the company has obliged to makes the company to mandate those necessary corrective and precautionary measures within their operations. Hence, by having the necessary acts mentioned here, any person who is reviewing or carrying out an initial environmental review will get an idea whether the company is doing the activities and processes in a environmentally justified manner. Let us now move on to slide 16, that is part 7, solid waste management. Like the previous parts, here also we must collect information about the personnel who have been interviewed, and their vital inputs have to be entered under comments. Now, based on the feedback and the inputs, we need to categorize them as good to go, that is green zone, or intervention required, that is gray zone. So basically, what is the information that we need to collect? Majorly, what are the different types of solid waste which is being generated in the premises? In what quantity are these solid wastes being generated? How are we going about disposing the waste? What is the methodology that is being practiced? Now, most importantly, we need to collect the list of waste collectors, okay, if in case it's an on-site disposal. Also, what are the various waste reduction and recycling measures? Now, when it comes to the concept of solid waste management, it is imperative that we have data on date, time and quantity with respect to solid waste disposal. When was it given? How much was it given? In what form was it given? What time was it given, and for whom it was given to? Alongside all this, data must also be available or has to be provided in this worksheet with respect to the licenses which has been procured by the company for carrying out or managing solid waste. Yes, just like the previous parts, here also the company must list the various regulations or legislations that deal with solid waste. With this information, now let us move on to the next slide. Slide 17. This deals with noise and other waste management. Part 8. With respect to noise, the primary information that needs to be collected is the noise analysis reports. That is, what are the various sources of noise and what are the various noise levels being generated. The next information that needs to be collected is there any noise control process flow diagram? What are the standard operating procedures and the system operating manuals have to be provided. In this worksheet, the noise control regulations, that is the noise control standards, have to be mentioned. Now, moving on from noise, let us talk about other waste management. Now, please remember that this part 8, that is noise and other waste management, may apply or may not apply to all the organizations. It depends on the nature and type of organization. Keeping this in mind, let us now discuss about radioactive waste management. The information that needs to be collected here includes the various sources within the organization from where radioactive waste is being generated, the types of radioactive materials being employed, the types of radioactive waste being generated with respect to their quantitative aspects. Again, we need to understand and we need to provide the data with respect to the licenses which has been procured for handling radioactive waste by the company, and all the legislations or laws or acts that comes under the purview of radioactive waste management also needs to be provided here. Now let us move on to slide 18, wherein part 9 and part 10 have been displayed for your kind perusal. Part 9 basically deals with environmental incidents and accidents. Basically, if any non-conformity has taken place within the organization or due to the organization, it could be a major non-conformance or a minor non-conformance. then the data of these should be documented with respect to the dates, the time, the causes. Alongside, also documentation must be provided with respect to what preventive and corrective measures have been taken to address this. Part 10, which deals with environmental training, is a indicator of management performance or management's attitude towards environmental protection or the concern towards the safety of its workers. So here data has to be provided with respect to what all training programs have been conducted, okay, and what is due to be conducted, and the information will be with respect to the title of the program, the theme of the program, nature of the program, date, time, and who all have participated and whom all is this training meant for. Now let us move on to the next slide, slide 19, which showcases part 11 and 12. Part 11 deals with environmental audit. So the documentation here deals with if any environmental audit has been conducted, and if so, all the details with respect to that has to be mentioned. For instance, what was the scope of the audit, the location of the audit, the date, and who was the auditor, and so forth. The last part of your initial environmental review is part 12, and that basically speaks about the supplier and contractor consideration. So herein you need to list all the major suppliers and contractors, and alongside this the data must also include the environmental assessment of the suppliers, of the contractors with respect to their services, with respect to their products. The most important thing that needs to be noted here is what is the selection criteria for choosing these suppliers or contractors for the organization. That also has to be showcased in the last part of this initial environmental review, that is part 12. Let us now move on to slide 20, which deals with the summary of today's presentation. So by now we have understood that the initial environmental review is not an audit. Rather, it's a very important step, the first step, which helps in creating an environmental management system. To sum up an effective environmental review, please note the following. Firstly, it's about identification of the external and internal issues that can positively or negatively affect any organization's EMS. Nextly, it deals with determination of the need and expectation of stakeholders. Thirdly, it gives a snapshot of the organization's current environmental performance, that is, all its existing practices, procedures that concern environmental management. Nextly, it's about the identification of the direct and indirect environmental aspects and impacts. Further, it deals with the identification of the applicable legal requirements. Moving on, it deals with the assessment of the significance of environmental impacts with a life cycle perspective. Finally, initial environmental review is all about identifying the risks and opportunities which is associated with the environmental management system. Let us now move on to the next slide, slide number 21. I have listed the references here for your kind perusal. Slide 22. This basically deals with the lesson for the next class, that is environmental policy. Now, we are all aware that when it comes to the implementation of an EMS, the first step is the initial environmental review. Progressing in the same manner, the second step is the environmental policy itself. Environmental policy, to brief you, is a policy that showcases the commitment of an organization towards environmental improvement. So we shall be discussing more about environmental policy in the next session. I thank one and all. This is Dr. Rajesh Gopinath signing out. Godspeed.